I'm Marshall Kozloff, and this is Arsenal of Democracy.
Never before has our American civilization been in such danger as now. Danger against which we must prepare. But we well know that we cannot escape danger by crawling into bed and pulling the covers over our heads. We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
This week, my Hudson colleague Thomas Duesterberg has a new report out on the state of China's economy and why he feels an economic slowdown is coming and how the country could possibly be on the precipice of a financial crisis. In this conversation, we discuss the implications of U.S. foreign policy, how we should respond when it comes to a pressure campaign, given those economic vulnerabilities, especially given the CCP's responsibility for China's economy, and of course, end on the state of America's manufacturing industry, which goes to Thomas's previous work throughout his Hudson career.
The Chinese economy is not driven by internal consumption. It's built on increasing production, and so that they have needed outlets for their markets. And their foreign policy, to a large extent, is driven, for instance, in South Asia, Africa, Latin America, on a drive to accumulate resources needed to fuel their economy. I mean, it's oil, gas, raw minerals. I mean, for instance, for making batteries now. So that aggressiveness around the world, all parts, especially the developed world, is premised, I think, on the need to keep their economy going through an export engine.
Hope you all enjoy the conversation. Tom Duesterberg, welcome to Arsenal of Democracy.
Pleasure to be with you, Marshall.
Yeah, I'm glad to chat with you. So you have a new report out the week that we're recording that I'm sure folks are going to be deeply interested in. I'd love for you just to introduce the report and offer a brief summary before we get into discussing your findings.
I have the view that the Chinese economy is a lot weaker than most analysts think it is, and that they don't have the internal means to re-stimulate the economy, and that therefore they are somewhat vulnerable to, if you want, pressure from the United States. And my overall view is that China has been for 20 or 30 years systematically undermining some of the major institutions that have made the post-war economy work as well as it has, such as the trade system, the international development finance system, and some other parts of the system. And in doing so, they actually have undermined both the nature, the structure of those institutions, especially the World Trade Organization and the free trade system, if you will. They've hurt our economy, and they're trying to displace the United States as one of the leaders of a certain way that the world has worked, and I think worked very well in a democratic, fairly open market type system. So because of that, the economic problems in China are important. And those problems are everything from a Ponzi scheme in the real estate sector, which at one point represented almost a third of the Chinese economic output, to over-leveraging. They're deeply in debt, partly because of the real estate crisis, but the government finances are in bad shape. In China, most of the social services, pensions, unemployment insurance, medical care, education are paid for by local governments or provincial governments instead of by the central government. But while the central government takes over 80% of the tax resources, they only pay for about 15% of the actual provision of government services. And local governments eventually, with help from Beijing, get a little over 50% of the resources that are available through their tax system and other forms of income to the government. So it's a huge gap, 50% or more, slightly more of revenue, 85% of the expenditures. It's a big problem. And because China has, for the last 20 years, used massive financial stimulus to keep their economy growing as fast as it has, they've done things like build impressive infrastructure around China, but it's overbuilt. And number one, their investments in things like infrastructure or state-owned manufacturing enterprises are not returning the sorts of profits and efficiency that they once did. The only way the Chinese, in my analysis, are going to be able to keep growing is by getting financing from the West and by continuing to run trade surpluses with the West. And of course, their whole system is built on overproduction of manufactured goods. So that's been a major problem that's politically salient in the United States. And there's so I offer a bunch of thoughts about how we can push back against what the Chinese are doing. These include things like export controls, continuing the tariff structures set up first under the Biden or the Trump administration and basically continued by the Biden administration. Not making available the ability of American firms to invest in sensitive industries that are related to defense, but also I propose that on outward bound investment, portfolio investment, buying stocks, that we also put limits on what American companies and hopefully our allies in Europe will do. I also suggest that we be more aggressive about working with the developing world, which has been exploited by China for things like oil, gas, and critical materials, rare earths, battery materials, and the like. We do a better job of working with our allies for development finance to compete with the Chinese, basically, and to reduce our vulnerabilities on the markets like rare earths or battery materials that the Chinese have captured.
It seems to me that so much of U.S. foreign policy towards China and the broader Indo-Pacific region has been premised on this post-Cold War growth story for China itself. How would U.S. foreign policy as a whole have to reorient itself if the China growth story is no longer what it has been for the past few decades?
Let's go back to sort of the start when the end of the Mao era in China, when Deng Xiaoping took over. There was a lot of optimism on the part of American and other Western analysts and foreign policy officials that China was going to be what was called a responsible stakeholder in the global economic order. And that they would be cooperative with the West because they wanted to have a successful economy and do business with the economy. And that premise slowly over time was undermined by what is essentially mercantilist Chinese economic behavior. There's a lot of disillusionment now in the United States on a bipartisan basis, growing disillusionment in Europe, the Pacific Rim, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Australia, all have felt the impact of Chinese mercantilism. And so the assumption, again, that this huge Chinese market would be a positive force in the global economy, and therefore we needed to accommodate them in various ways, I think has been undermined by Chinese behavior. And so some of these policies that I talked about at the start are coming to have broader support, I think, as a means to try to induce China to do what we thought they would do 40 years ago when they entered the global economy again, which is have a relatively open market and not be as aggressive in trying to exploit other developing countries around the world.
It seems as if every few years there are a variety of individuals and institutions that make predictions about Chinese economic slowdowns and underperformance. I'm curious, what makes this time different than previous situations where folks have said there are going to be economic problems on the horizon for them?
What makes this period, I think, somewhat different is the accumulation of problems in China. And you can still find a lot of economists, a lot of policy officials around the world who think that because China, for the last 40 years, has always found a way to keep the growth engine going, that they'll find another way. But if my argument is that if you look closer at the Chinese economy, the problems which have accumulated over time, such as massive reliance on debt-financed infrastructure development, even provision of government services, plus relying on, I call it a Ponzi scheme in real estate. The probably more polite ways to describe it. The Chinese people did need to have more housing, but it's so overbuilt now. I mean, there are tens of millions of housing units that have been paid for and are being built that they essentially don't need and they can't sell. So this accumulation of problems is starting to influence geostrategic thinking a lot more than it did even 5 years ago.
Do you see a tie between China's economic growth engine and their broader ambitions in the Indo-Pacific, especially as regards to Taiwan or the South China Sea or other areas where you're obviously seeing the U.S. and our allies running into potential conflict with the Chinese?
From a purely economic point of view, Taiwan is not the central focus for them. That's almost it's an ideological view based on the thinking of many Chinese leaders going back at least until Mao, that Taiwan is inextricably a part of Greater China. So that's kind of ideological. The more economically driven part of the Chinese aggressive efforts around the world, building the Belt and Road initiatives, building railroads all the way across Central Asia into Europe, accumulating and building new ports in the seas, is all in some sense economically driven, in the sense that the Chinese economy is not driven by internal consumption. It's built on increasing production. And so that they have needed outlets for their markets, and their foreign policy to a large extent is driven, for instance, in South Asia, Africa, Latin America, on a drive to accumulate resources needed to fuel their economy. I mean, it's oil, gas, it's raw minerals. I mean, for instance, for making batteries now. So that aggressiveness around the world in all parts, especially the developed world, is premised, I think, on the need to keep their economy going through an export engine.
I'd love for you to kind of expand out when it comes to the pressure opportunity this presents for the United States. So what are the tools the U.S. can use to exert pressure? And then what are the ends of such a campaign?
Well, I'll start with the ends of any campaign would be to incentivize the Chinese leadership, which is the Chinese Communist Party, to ratchet back on their expansionary plans, their aggressiveness, which is increasingly backed by military strength in places like the South China Sea, but also in the Arctic, of all places, which could be a transportation network to get goods more quickly to Europe, for instance. And so the tools that we have, I mean, we've used export controls with some success. I mean, denying advanced semiconductors to the Chinese telecommunications firms like Huawei basically did kill their smartphone business. We have tried to limit the Chinese acquisition of sensitive technology, sensitive in the sense of being useful to their military ambitions. Slowing access to our markets through the tariffs imposed by President Trump and continued by the Biden administration has had some impact. Chinese economies, even in their own statistics, has really slowed the last few years, and it's probably going to continue to slow. I mean, the data coming out of China this year is very weak. An interesting area for exerting some pressure on China is in the financial sector. I spend a lot of time in the report looking at how China has become involved in not only global finance, development finance in Africa, Latin America, and how exploitative that is. It benefits China more than the countries where their projects are financed. But also they've gotten involved in things like sanctions evasion for Russia and Iran. China's the biggest buyer of Iranian oil and Russian oil in the world, and they're avoiding U.S. sanctions. So they're impeding policies of the United States and Europe, for instance, to try to assist in the end of the war in the Ukraine and help the Ukrainians to survive, basically. So an additional part of this is that the Chinese banking system is complicit in not only evading sanctions for buying oil and other sanctioned products. I mean, China is a source of, for instance, semiconductors going into Russia so that they can keep their advanced military weapons going. But China is also, not directly related to this, but gotten involved in the worldwide drug trade. They're the ones who do, it's not only the fentanyl trade that they've been involved with, but they're deeply complicit with money laundering with the Mexican drug cartels. They're involved in Europe. There have been major busts in Europe as well as the United States recently for Chinese figures that are involved in selling drugs and then laundering the money somehow to get it to the perpetrators of the drug trade. So for all these reasons, I suggest that we need to take a close look at the Chinese banking system. And we have many tools in our arsenal to put sanctions on Chinese banks or others that they're working with to do this sanctions evasion and drug money laundering. And I suggest that we try out, maybe on a small scale, sanctioning some of the Chinese banks so that they get the message that we're not going to tolerate this sort of behavior. And that's especially important, I think, now with Chinese working with the Iranians, who are, of course, behind the war against Hamas in the Middle East now, and they're working with the Russians. And so I think it's important that we look at ways we can limit the Chinese ability to do this, and also not to, in a general sort of way, bail out their economy, which is hungry for outside capital because they're so over-leveraged internally in China, and so many of their loans are going bad. Their whole banking system is under some stress.
To your point about avoiding bailing out the Chinese economy, it seems though that there are plenty of forces, actors, et cetera, in the U.S. that also rely on a strong Chinese economy. What will the balancing act be when it comes to factoring that together if there are calls for bailouts or other forms of economic intervention?
Well, I mean, it's a good point, Marshall. I mean, there's opposition in the United States partly from Wall Street, but not only from Wall Street, about pushing too hard on the Chinese economy. I mean, there's still the thought, and there's some reality to it. We do sell a lot of goods to China, and our economy, relies on Chinese low technology medical products, just to give one example. So it's going to be a big political question going forward of how hard to push on the Chinese economy. There's an example right now as we speak where there's a proposal in the Congress that's being debated to ratchet up our ability, the tools that we have to limit U.S. investments in China on a selective basis. And there's fierce opposition to that from both sides of the aisle, as well as many who are strongly in favor of it. And so it would be useful, I think, to have this debate in the presidential election, because it's these questions about how hard to push are not going to go away. The Chinese, under Xi Jinping at least, are not going to change their behavior. So these questions are going to be with us for a while.
Something I wonder about, because you made the statement about looking into the Chinese banking system, to what degree are these systems or economic outcomes, how opaque are they? Like, to what degree do we have visibility into the system to either assess the claims or actually look at the potential impacts thereof?
It's really tough. And China is good at shifting things around. Something as simple as understanding how indebted Chinese banks or Chinese local governments are is extremely difficult, because when they have a problem, they create a new entity, a shadow bank, something called local government financing vehicles, to shift the debt from one place to another. On a larger scale, it's interesting that, again, in the news today, not today, the last few weeks, was the guilty plea of the founder of the major cryptocurrency exchange, Binance. And if you read the fine print in the Treasury's indictment of the company and of the head of that company. You have the astounding figure of they did over 100,000 probably illicit transactions that should have been reported in the last, the company's only been in existence for 5 or 6 years. So 100,000 transactions, and some of them fairly large. Over nearly $1 trillion worth of business with Iran alone. And much of that was sanctions evasion stuff. So there's some visibility into that, but for the most part, it's hard to track down. And that's one reason that China has wanted to be a leader in digital currencies, and it has used vehicles like cryptocurrency exchanges to mask their activities. They want to get out. They don't not only want to hide it, but they want to avoid the response that the United States might have in sanctioning their behavior, because if they can hide it, then our tools of sanctions are less powerful.
I think the last question on this report I'll ask before we do a broader one on manufacturing is, I think a key part of your career story and your work at Hudson is the fact that back in the 90s and early 2000s, you very much rejected the bipartisan consensus when it came to China's impact on the United States and entrance into the global economic sphere. When it comes to today, the bipartisan consensus has clearly shifted in a direction more to your liking. Given that, what is your assessment of where we are as a country when it comes to confronting these issues and these challenges? Are you optimistic? Are you neutral? Are you pessimistic? Like, what do the next few years look like from your perspective?
In terms of the U.S. domestic response or the sort of the geopolitical response?
Both, actually.
Okay. Well, I think the ground has been shifting at a sort of a geostrategic level where there's more and more recognition of what the Chinese model is. You mentioned manufacturing, and that is the core strength of the Chinese economy. And their typical approach to building out manufacturing is to subsidize production at the start so that they acquire the technology that's needed. But an interesting aspect of the Chinese system is that, as we talked about at the outset, a lot of the application of Chinese policy is done at the local level or the provincial level. So let's take the electric vehicle industry, which is another one that the Chinese are coming to dominate. Every local government and every province in China wanted to be involved in the electric vehicle industry. So they would use domestic, their local resources, and they would encourage their banks to fund startup projects. So 2 or 3 years ago, there were over 500 electric vehicle manufacturing companies in China. I think they're down to about 100 now. But that is a reason why they always end up with overproduction. And even in China, there are stories about these huge numbers of EVs that are sitting on lots that they're unable to sell because the supply has gotten ahead of demand. That's why they need to export to the West, essentially, but also the global South, if you will. We saw that in the solar industry. We saw it in steel industry, many other industries. So it's just a characteristic of the Chinese economy, the way that they have structured the economy and their growth model. So it's been harmful, to the U.S. manufacturing sector. Europe is starting to feel it in a big way now because their economy is still highly dependent on the auto industry and machinery industries. The Europeans used to be the leaders in high-speed rail and, for instance, wind energy technology, and the Chinese have slowly driven them out of business. So because of that model, it's caused both the United States and Europe to be more aggressive about using, industrial policies of one sort or another to partially to combat the Chinese. My own view is we need to rely more on trade measures and export control measures to accomplish the same purpose. But these questions are going to be with us for a while because the Chinese economy is big. They're good at manufacturing. Let's admit that. And so we have to do a better job ourselves at more efficient manufacturing. We need to do a better job of getting the supply chain, for instance, for batteries, but also for things like semiconductors, raw materials. We haven't been very good about integrating the back end, if you will, of these industries with the actual production end. So we have to do a better job, but we also have to keep the pressure on China to back off a little bit on their aggressive mercantilism.
You actually answered the final question about manufacturing, state thereof, and what we can do to move forward. So, Tom, I think that is an excellent place to end this conversation. Folks can check out your report linked in the show notes or click the link to the panel you featured at Hudson earlier this week. Thank you for joining me on Arsenal of Democracy.
Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure to be with you.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit subscribe below so you don't miss any episodes of Arsenal of Democracy. If you'd like to learn more about the topics covered on this episode or just are interested in broader content on U.S. foreign and domestic policy, be sure to go to hudson.org. See you soon.